So you're thinking about problems that are often quite difficult and challenging and long-standing. If you think about colonialism, if you think about sexual violence, all of these issues that have been around for generations and generations and generations. Climate change, these issues aren't new, and so they can feel a bit overwhelming. On the one hand, you're trying to say why we need to do things. You also have to be able to give people a sense of why it's worth doing something, that you can have a positive effect.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news, and opinion from arts academics at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Julianne Evans aho. I'm Julianne Evans, the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts. And today I'm talking to Dr. Carisa Showden, who is a sociologist who specialises in contemporary feminist political theory, gender and sexuality studies, and young people's political engagement, which is where her latest co-authored book comes in. And it's called Fierce Hope, Youth Activism in Aotearoa, published by Bridget Williams Books in December last year. And it features activist groups with causes ranging from Indigenous rights and sexual violence to climate change and justice system reform. Kia ora, Carisa.
Morena, kia ora.
Thank you for coming in. I'm interested in what motivated you to write this book. I know it's in part your background and some of your co-authors, but what in particular made you think this is the right time for this book?
Thank you for that, and for mentioning my co-authors, because this was definitely a collaborative project. Karen Nairn, who's down at the University of Otago, actually was the lead author of the book and the principal investigator, because this book comes out of a Marsden grant that she spearheaded. And so the grant that funded this book went from 2018 to about mid-2020. And so then you have to think about the timing that goes into writing up a grant and applying for the grant and getting the grant. So then we're looking at about 2017 or so. And if you can think about all the politics that were happening at that rather tumultuous time globally, but also a lot of the narratives around young people and activism, especially, Greta Thunberg and her climate activism, and many other, sort of the anti-imperialist, the anti-nationalist politics that were happening, as well as the reverse. So you had these sort of competing narratives that were bubbling up. And on the one hand, you're hearing about young people as apathetic or as inward focused, as individualistic. They're just tied to their phones and not really engaged. And then on the other hand, what you have is these narratives around these young people who are, they're going to save the world. They're going to solve all of our problems for us. And they're sort of hyper engaged. And Karen and the other co-authors, Judith Sligo, who's also at Otago, Kyle Matthews at Otago, and Joanna Kidman, who's at Wellington, we've all have both activist background histories, but also a longstanding interest in young people and in activism. And so in bringing this all together, we were thinking, what is it? How would young people speak for themselves about what they think about the future, what they want for the future? And for those who are engaged in activism, why are they doing it? What's their story?
And 6 groups I think you spoke to, didn't you? Do you want to talk a little bit about who they are and what they care about?
Absolutely. And we did end up with 6 groups in the study. We talked about a number of different options for groups to include. We wanted to make sure that we had groups from across the country. We didn't want it to just be a Wellington study or an Auckland study. Not every group that we approached was able at that time to work with us, but we ended up with a really fantastic range of groups that we got to work with. One thing we knew for sure, given what was happening at the time, is that if a group at the time that was called Save Our Unique Landscape and then became Protecti Humatau, that campaign had really started to ramp up. And if they had the capacity or the interest in working with us, we really wanted to work with them. As many people described it, as sort of the bastion point of this generation. And it would have felt incomplete to be writing about this topic and not to work with them. And luckily they invited us in and allowed us to collaborate with them and to just watch what they were doing and do any little thing that we could here and there to try to be part of that. We also worked with Thursdays in Black at the University of Auckland. So that's a group working for a world without sexual violence. Thursdays in Black is a national and international organization, but we worked specifically with the Auckland campus-based group. And then Generation Zero, which is, they're working on climate change and issues around climate change. And they have many chapters across the country. We ended up, again, working with the Auckland-based group, partly because I was here and able to do that, and they had the capacity to work with us at that time. Other members of the team worked with Just Speak, which, as you mentioned, is a group that's looking at carceral reform and the justice system and sort of the problems with the justice system and how can we try to improve that. We worked with Inside Out, which is a group that's working on, queer young people's needs, interests, and rights, and sort of working for them and with them in lots of different kinds of ways. And then Action Station, which I think most people, if they aren't really clued into the space, may be the one group that they, other than Protecting Aotearoa, that they've heard of, because they do so many different kinds of things through their online petition platform, amplifying and helping to organize campaigns for lots of different issues.
What impressed you particularly about these groups? I think you said you felt like successful campaigns had something in common in terms of how they approached things and how they enlisted people. Can you talk a bit about that?
So I would say that when groups had successful campaigns, and all of the groups had campaigns, some successes as we worked with them, and they also obviously had some setbacks, as you do in this kind of space when you're working on these huge issues. But one of the things that many of them shared, or I would say all of them shared, that enabled them to be successful is they thought through how to tell a positive story or to bring some kind of positive feeling to allow people to see that they could actually do something good, right? So you're thinking about problems that are often quite difficult and challenging and long-standing. If you think about colonialism, if you think about sexual violence, all of these issues that have been around for as long as for generations and
climate
generations
change.
and generations. Climate change, these issues aren't new, and so they can feel a bit overwhelming. And so, as on the one hand, you're trying to say why we need to do things, you also have to be able to give people a sense of why it's worth doing something, that you can have a positive effect. So if you can give people a way to be agents of change, show them how they can work with others to make a positive contribution, not going to solve the problem overall, but can work toward a solution. And that's something that really came through for us. If I think back to early on when we were first meeting to talk about some of the initial interviews that we did, and we were talking among the research team about what was coming out in the interviews and what we were noticing. And the thing that was most striking to us was just how hungry young people are for community. And that, of course, they were interested and they were coming to these groups because of the issues that were involved, and they cared about the issues. But what they were really looking for was people to come together with, people who shared their values and who, you build friendships and collaborations through this work, and you feel much less alone. And that really came through in all of the interviews, but from the very get-go, you could just see how, young people not just wanting to think about climate change, but think about who are my people and how can I be supported in this and how can we support each other.
That works as an antidote to that thing that we hear, that young people feel very depressed about their future. I mean, if I was an 18-year-old or 15-year-old, I would probably be feeling the same, that sense of there not being any hope for them. I think it's a great way to turn that into an active and hopeful situation for them.
It's interesting, the project started off with the title Hope in Action, ? And one of the things we asked all of the participants in the interviews was, is hope the right word? Or do you feel hopeful? Or how do you feel about, the future, or what motivates you to take action? And many of our participants did say, well, it's not that they were naive. They didn't think, oh, I can go out here and I can, change the world and solve all the future problems. But it was, for many of them, a mix of things. They were angry. A lot of people were very angry about climate change and about inaction on climate change. They were angry about sexual violence. They're angry about, colonialism, the effects of colonialism. They're angry about lots of different things. But that was combined with a lot of other emotions. They were thinking about, anxiety, but they were also thinking about what could I do, and churning that into, if I work with others, there's a chance that we could change the course of this or have some effect and have things not be so bad. So you can be both angry about what has been done and angry about the state of the world and angry about decisions that politicians are making, while also channeling that into a sense of possibility, hopefulness, that we can do something more than just be angry, that we can channel that anger into something positive. Or I shouldn't say that anger itself is not positive. Anger itself is a way of diagnosing that an injustice has happened, right? And getting your anger taken seriously is a way of showing that you're being respected in the world too.
It doesn't have to be big gestures either. You were talking about Thursdays in Black, and they're a group of people that get together and they dress in black on a Thursday. They don't have to do something large to be taken seriously. They just have to keep on trying. And making that little teaspoon analogy you were talking about, what was that about?
So this is an analogy that I owe to a feminist blog that was run out of the United States for many years called Shakesville. And in that community, one of the things they talked about is, if you think about the ocean as the oppression or the problem that we're facing, none of us individually can empty that out, can solve the problem. But if we come together and we each take our teaspoons, and teaspoon by teaspoon we work to dig out or empty out the problem, we can collectively come together and make a real difference. And those teaspoons are the small and the bigger actions that we take. So it's not one or the other, but it's both of these. We do take some big actions, big marches. Generation Zero had worked with lots of other groups to effectively pass through the zero carbon, or help to promote the Zero Carbon Act, and got that passed through Parliament. But smaller things, as you were saying, or things that seem small. So if you see a group of people wearing black on Thursdays, you might not necessarily think anything about it. But once you see the Thursdays in black on the shirt, you see working for a world without sexual violence, it signals that people are aware of the problem and they're not going to be quiet about it.
And Protect Ihamato, that group of people didn't wait really to fix everything, because they're still in the process of contesting the land, I guess, and what should happen to it. They're still living there, aren't they? They're still on the land, isn't that true? But they're also, in the time that you spoke to them, they were living a particular way on the land that had been owned by Fletchers and is now owned by the government. And they were sort of showing people, not just in some far distant future, this is how things could happen. They were doing it then. They were welcoming people in. People were, you said, having gardens, all those kinds of things.
That's right. You don't have to wait for things to get better. Part of how you make them better is by doing them. And this sense of, planting these community gardens and inviting people on and giving people a place, people who needed an address or a place to stay, opening up and welcoming them to this space, bringing in school groups and sort of teaching them about the land and the history of the land, both, the contested history, but also the possibilities for the future. It's a way of living your values and living the kind of future that you want to see, living it now. And again, you start small so that you can build big.
You were telling me about the process of writing this book with your co-authors, and how in some ways it reflected the groups that you were speaking to, in that they were often led by one person, but with lots of other people connecting up and making decisions about things. Can you talk a bit about how that worked?
Sure. The book is very much a collective endeavor. I couldn't say any single person was responsible, full stop, for any one chapter. We had multiple, not just meetings, but we had multiple retreats where we would spend 3 or 4 days together brainstorming. We had whiteboards. We were erasing, writing back more, erasing, writing more. Both lots of laughs and a certain amount of, thinking through in very serious ways, the ways that what we wanted this book to say and how we wanted to present it. And then obviously at some point somebody has to sit down and put words on the paper. So different people would start different chapters, but we had already talked through what that was going to look like and thought through language and metaphor and quotes and how it would all fit together. And then once one person had started on a chapter, somebody else would continue to work on it, would wordsmith it. Every author who's listed on that cover has been through every chapter in that book multiple times. So I could not say, oh, I did 20% of that chapter and 30% of that chapter, and Karen did, 5% of this. It's a collaborative effort, and that's what it takes.
It really does. And have you shown the chapters that you all wrote to the groups that you wrote them about?
So we contacted participants when we were using their quotes in different chapters. And what we wanted to do with that is to give them a chance to make sure that they were still happy with being presented in that way, which is not to say that, that we were going to say, do you want to change how you think? But just to remind them at a moment in time in the past, this is what you said about the emotional labor of activism, or this is what you said about your work on this campaign, or the group's work on this campaign. And are you still happy for us to include that? Are you still happy to be named? Some people in the book have their real names attached to their quotes. Other people preferred to have pseudonyms. We don't distinguish, who has which in order to make that sort of work. But we didn't want people to feel blindsided by the book. We wanted them to see, what from their interviews. And their interviews were so rich, and they shared so much with us over the course. For many people, we had one interview, and then a year later we would talk with them again. So that's a lot of time and a lot of their energy and thoughts that went into this. We couldn't use everything, but we tried to represent the different members of the different groups as faithfully as we could. But we also showed them, here's the context in which this will appear, just so you have a sense of what's coming. But none of them have yet seen the whole manuscript or read the whole book yet. Yeah.
Because it was 2018 to mid-2020 was the period that you looked at, just coming into the beginning of COVID, which gave you a kind of a nice way to end it in a way, or way to think about the material.
Yes. So we finished up with our interviews and our participant observation as the first lockdown was happening. So we were into that first lockdown and still doing their last few interviews on Zoom, obviously. And then our participant observation was more observing social media, since nobody could go anywhere. But one of the things that was really interesting about that particular moment of time, which you might remember, is that this big, new thing was happening, and we were all trying to make sense of it. But one of the things that happened here was we came together. We were the team of 5 million, and we did big things, and it really showed what was possible. I think it's fair to say that since the middle of 2020, a lot of things have happened, and a lot of that sense of possibility and hopefulness about what we could do has dissipated. But at that moment in time, it was really palpable. You could feel it, and it was exciting. I hope we don't go through a global pandemic again, but if there was another way to get back some of that sense of we can do this, that would be really wonderful.
I agree. So the book is out now.
We can buy it. Yes.
Where can we buy it? Everywhere? Anywhere?
The bookseller of your choice, your preferred bookseller should have a copy. And yes, it came out at the very end of 2022. So we just missed Christmas, I think, but there's always Christmas this year.
Absolutely. And if there was something, or maybe more than one thing, that you would like above all else for your readers to get out of this book, what would it be?
I think it's fair to say a couple of things. If I think about the participants, what I hope is that they will see themselves reflected in this book and have a sense of being able to see the successes that they had and the important work that they did, and see themselves well represented here, and a kind of time capsule for them.
And feel proud, I'm sure.
I hope so. They should feel proud. If I think about other people who might be interested in activism, either in studying it or doing it themselves, that they see maybe they can inspire them to sort of take on their own work and find their own communities, or to continue the work of these groups or their own groups, whichever they prefer. But I also hope that anybody who reads it will get a sense of the fun and the community that's part of activism. It is a lot of hard work, and you are dealing with a number of what we might call wicked problems, or long-standing issues that are very serious. But it's also a chance to come together, to be with people, to share in community, and to really support each other. And sometimes that can be a lot of fun too.
Thank you so much for coming and talking to us today. I really wish you well with this book. I think it's fantastic. And thank you for listening to the Research and Reason podcast.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts by following us on social media.